So for those of you who don't know, which is pretty much impossible considering the fact I've been talking about it almost non-stop for the last month, I went to my first ever con as a panelist this last weekend, and that con was Comicpalooza. And at this con, I was slated to talk about all different kinds of things, like how Boruto is saving Naruto, finishing the end of Hunter x Hunter, and how to become a YouTuber. However, between all these highly educational talks that I was giving to my adoring, almost entirely male audience, I was chatting with said almost entirely male audience. What, am I intimidating? All right, you know what? I'm gonna come out and say it. I have a 7% female following rate. Is it the tattoos? Is it the glasses? Not that I want women to follow me. They're icky. All my fellas. And while I got a bunch of really interesting and really unique questions over the course of this weekend, I got asked one question a whole lot more than literally any other. And that was, what's gonna happen to Yuta? And genuinely, that's a really good question. See, we dove into it a little bit in our Chapter 261 breakdown, but all the people that were asking me this question had already seen that video. So apparently I didn't do quite good enough of a job explaining the possible outcomes for Yuta and his continuance on Earth. And here's the thing, we already know the possibilities of what could happen to Yuta and his body and brain, because Gege did the thing in Chapter 261 that he does ever so often, where a side character who probably shouldn't know as much as they're currently knowing and talking about lays it out flat for us and tells us the possible scenarios for the future of this important character. Now, in the case of Chapter 261, that character who had a bit more information than they probably should have been privy to was Meme, who broke down 3 very distinct possibilities for us that are all dependent on how exactly Kenjaku's body swapping curse technique works. And thus, if Gege follows the style of writing he's done for the last 261 chapters, one of these 3 possibilities will come true. However, considering the fact that Chapter 261 is pretty much cemented that every JJK fan has to be in a F it, we ball kind of attitude in order to enjoy this manga, as any expectations you have for the future of this manga are just summarily thrown out the window as soon as another chapter is revealed, it is important to be pliable and creative with the possibilities of Yuta's future. Which is why today, in more detail, I want to cover the 3 possibilities that Meme said might happen with Yuta's body, and give you 2 possible theories that are outside of anything Meme hypothesized. That is to say, today I want to talk about 5 possible futures for Yuta that we'll see happening in, I don't know, the next 3 or 4 chapters. Because today we're talking Yuta's future revealed. But before we get to revealing anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you love the idea of me breaking down some of your favorite anime and manga, go ahead and follow my anime podcast, Talk is Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime and manga this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So, Yuta, kind of in a unique situation. In fact, he's in a situation that only he has ever been in. But what is that situation? How did he get into it? And how can he possibly get out of it, if he even can do that? Well, before we get to talking about what Yuta's future possibilities are, let's briefly go over how Yuta got in the situation he's currently in the first place, so that we can reestablish the basis of our knowledge in order to move forward with the most information possible. For those of you who have purposely tried to push as much of Chapter 260 and 261 out of their brain as possible, genuinely, I can't say I blame you. It's a trauma response. It's why I don't remember the majority of my childhood. So for those of you who have purposely blocked out the idea of Yuta getting cut in half, let me remind you of why he was cut in half, how he got cut in half, and why they're trying to figure out how to make him uncut in half. See, about 10 or so chapters ago, things were looking real good for the Yuta Yuji coalition. Yuta opened his domain, and the innate technique he applied to his domain was Jacob's Ladder. That means that the guaranteed hit factor curse technique of his domain expansion was Jacob's Ladder. So all those not wrapped in a simple domain would be immediately hit with a Jacob's Ladder, assuming that Yuta wanted them to be. And therefore, when Sukuna's simple domain is stripped away from his body, he's hit with a full-powered Jacob's Ladder. That allows for Yuji to close in with a punch and connect to Megumi's soul. However, Megumi's got his phone on Do Not Disturb. So Sukuna, somehow powerful enough in this moment to use a world-cutting cleave, used one against Yuta, and it apparently cut him in half, though it was incredibly hard to see in the manga because Gege did his scribbly thing. Looking back on it now, that was probably purposeful, so people didn't know that Yuta was truly down and out of this fight. Yuta, after being cut in half, was either brought to Shoko by Rika, who was carrying him, or was brought to Shoko by Wee. It wasn't until last chapter that it was revealed that Yuta was dying, and the only thing keeping him tethered to this mortal realm was Rika. However, fortunately for all of us, Yuta was the person who killed Kenjaku, and Yuta fed Kenjaku's body to Rika, which allowed him to copy Kenjaku's curse technique. That curse technique being body swapping, the ability to become a little brain with a mouth on it and put that brain into dead people's bodies. And while it seemed as though the Kusakabe Coalition has had a myriad of last chance plans, this appears to be their true last chance plan. As Yuta said that he would only switch into Gojo's body if Gojo lost and he couldn't beat Sukuna with his own domain. And thus, after Gojo's bisecting, Iwi grabbed Gojo's body and his legs and brought him back to Shoko, who stitched his body back together. And then they switched Yuta's brain into Gojo's body and told Yuta, hey, his body's stitched back together, but that doesn't mean all of his veins, muscles, and nerves are fixed. And thus, when you get into Gojo's body, you're gonna have to maximize your reverse curse technique output, which leaves Yuta's body now cut in half and brainless somewhere in the hands of Shoko, who is objectively probably stitching it back together as we speak.
But why, Nick? Why would they need to stitch together Yuta's body?
Well, for a couple of reasons, actually. And this brings us to the part of the video where we talk about the 3 possibilities that Mei laid out. So, what are these 3 possibilities? Well, these 3 possibilities are all contingent on how exactly Kenjaku's body swapping technique works, be it either a continuous type, an intermittent type, or a single use type. So let's talk about the continuous type possibility first. See, if Kenjaku's body swapping technique is a continuous type curse technique, that means that Kenjaku needs to apply this curse technique to the body that he's in continuously. Think about it kind of like Limitless. See, the Limitless when used by Gojo is a continuous use technique, which is why in the hidden inventory arc, when he finally gets to Jujutsu High, he deactivates the Limitless technique, which allows for him to be stabbed by Toji. Now, obviously, after becoming the Enlightened One, Gojo found out a way to use his 6 eyes to allow himself to use the Limitless technique constantly by constantly using reverse curse technique to not only assuage the fatigue of using the Limitless technique always, but also assuage the wear that it does on his 6 eyes, making Gojo basically invincible unless you're able to cut the building behind him. But still, a good comparison for a continuous type curse technique is the Limitless. You need to apply it to yourself constantly. Now, out of all the possibilities, I deem this one to be the least likely. See, while Kenjaku had an insane amount of curse energy, Kenjaku didn't have the 6 eyes. And the only reason that Gojo was able to apply the Limitless to himself constantly is because he was able to figure out how to use the 6 eyes to make the Limitless use an infinitesimal amount of cursed energy. And thus the activation of the Limitless in all of Gojo's cursed techniques cost him effectively 0 cursed energy. And while it wouldn't surprise me at all, as really nothing surprises me in JJK anymore, that Kenjaku either had an insane amount of cursed energy that allowed him to constantly be applying the body swapping technique to whatever body he was in, or had some way to make it massively efficient like Gojo. With what we currently know about Kenjaku, this possibility seems like the least likely, which is kind of good news for Yuta. See, because if Kenjaku's body swapping technique is of the continuous type, that means that for the entirety of Yuta's time in Gojo's body, he has to be applying this body swap technique to Gojo's body. But there's a problem with that. And that is that Yuta can only copy a technique for 5 minutes at a time. Kind of like Monoma. Yes, there's another similarity between the ending of JJK and MHA. And thus, if Yuta can only copy the curse technique of Kenjaku for 5 minutes, that means that the second that Yuta is unable to continue copying Kenjaku's curse technique, then he'll lose control of Gojo's body, which is really bad. See, because in the circumstance where Yuta needs to constantly apply the body swapping technique to Gojo's body, if he loses access to that ability, he'll just be a dead brain in a dead body, at which point he would just simply die. Maybe. See, what's rather interesting about this possibility, and something that Mei does not talk about, is that Yuta's brain is alive and Gojo's body has been healed. So in the possibility that after 5 minutes Yuta's brain gives out on the body controlling technique, there's really no reason that Gojo's body should just collapse. Sure, Gojo was technically dead, and yes, the idea of souls do exist in the JJK universe. But Yuta's brain was alive before being passed to Gojo. And while there's a possibility that Kenjaku's body swapping technique doesn't connect his brain to the brain stem, and therefore his brain is actually separate from the body he's controlling, and therefore he's just controlling the body with cursed energy, there's also an equal possibility that the brain just jacks into the body. And in that circumstance, well, it technically wouldn't be Yuta controlling the body, as Yuta would lose control of the body swapping technique, and therefore his soul would probably die. Yuta's brain would be possibly functional in a functional Gojo's body, which is important to keep track of for a theory we're going to talk about at the end here. Another thing to keep in mind here is a rather curious interaction that happened between Kenjaku and Geto in the Shibuya incident. And that was the moment when Geto's body fought back against Kenjaku's brain and tried to choke him when he was taking down Gojo and sealing him in the prison room. A moment that confused and intrigued Kenjaku, as something like that had never happened before. Now, rather interestingly, a lot of connections have been being made between Gojo and Kenjaku in the most recent chapters. Most specifically, Gojo talking about how Kenjaku, in the moment where he left the Jujutsu Society in high school, got a head start on monsterizing himself to achieve what he dreamed was his best possible vision for the world. Now, Gojo talks about this before heading in to kill all the elders of the Jujutsu Society. Now, the obvious other connection between Gojo and Geto being built here is the fact that both of them have had their bodies taken over and have been used as weapons, which brings back important conversation topics like Geto asking Gojo if he's the strongest because he's Satoru Gojo, or if he's Satoru Gojo because he's the strongest, which is essentially being fleshed out right now since Yuta is controlling his body, which would establish the fact of whether or not Satoru Gojo was always going to be strong, or if Satoru Gojo was strong because he was Satoru Gojo. All this is to say that the intertwining of Gojo and Geto is getting as tight as it's ever been. And while that's really cute and compelling that the husbands are once again being tied to each other, in the moment that Geto grabbed Kenjaku by the throat, people began to theorize that Geto was still alive somewhere deep down in that body. And that eventually, with time, possibly when Kenjaku was weakened, Geto would retake control of the body and reinsert himself into the story. However, because of the way in which Kenjaku was killed, being beheaded, we never really got to see whether or not this possibility could come to fruition. But it's a possibility that this moment wasn't actually to show us whether or not Geto was going to come back, but whether or not Gojo could fight back. See, because Geto's body fighting back against Kenjaku, while some will say it was an instinct or a muscular reflex, could prove that a certain portion of the soul resides in the body, and if the body's walking around, the soul is still there. And thus, in the circumstance where Kenjaku's curse technique is a continuous type, it's a possibility that Gojo's body could reclaim control of Yuta's brain and Gojo could return in some capacity, which once again is going to be an integral part of a theory we'll talk about at the end of this video. But enough about the continuous type possibility, let's talk about the intermittent type possibility. And if you haven't noticed, I really struggle saying the word intermittent. That sixth and specifically. I mean, I can say specifically, but try saying it fast. Specifically. Actually, never mind. I think I've nailed that one. Anyways, before we get to talking about the possibilities of the intermittent curse technique application, let's talk about what intermittent curse technique activation even really is. So the possibilities of these endings are hinged on the idea that Kenjaku's curse technique might require him to occasionally reapply the technique to the body he's controlling. What do I mean by that? Well, instead of something like the Limitless, which needs to be constantly maintained, his endings hinge on the fact that the body swapping technique might be something that only needs to be maintained every couple of minutes, hours, days, weeks, or months. Now, as to how big the gap is between maintenance checkups, we can't necessarily say. Kenjaku might possibly need to reseed control of the body every week, or every 10 minutes, every hour, every year. There's really no way for us to know. And because of that, the possibilities surrounding around the intermittent curse technique endings are the most hazy. See, because remember, Yuta can only use the copy technique 5 minutes at a time. But if Kenjaku only needs to re-up on his control of a body once a month, and that means that Yuta taking control of Gojo's body should give him about a month. He gets to jog around as Gojo, and he probably wouldn't need that much time and probably wouldn't want to take that much time. See, because here's the thing. The intermittent possibilities are probably the most likely, and probably the most in line with Gege's writing style. Because if Kenjaku did need to re-up his curse technique intermittently, this opens the most doors for Gege. See, the fight with Sukuna isn't gonna last another day. It's not even gonna last another couple of hours. See, the entirety of everything that's happened in the manga since Sukuna Kaisen began has probably only been, I don't know, an hour or two? Probably less. This is why Gojo's body wasn't decayed when Yuta switched into it. He'd only been dead a couple of minutes. And thus, if Kenjaku's body swapping technique is truly intermittent, then assuming that Yuta and Yuji are able to defeat Sukuna, possibly together, then prior to ideally needing to re-up his control over Gojo's body, which he wouldn't be able to do because 5 minutes had gone by, Yuta would then switch back into his old, newly stitched up body and once again maximize his reverse curse technique output to heal his very decrepit and broken body, which is kind of a good ending. Yuji or Yuta or the combined force of both of them win in the battle against Sukuna. Before Yuta's body swapping ability runs out of time, he's able to swap back into his old body, and therefore he's still alive. And Gojo's body has been healed and also hasn't been dead that long, and thus there is a definitive possibility, since Amai was weirdly introduced in chapter 261 as part of Shoko's medical team, and his curse technique was finally revealed to allow himself to concentrate the sugars in his body to make sugar outside of his body, which seems like an absolutely worthless curse technique until Shoko chimes in and says, okay, we could use you on the medical team. So we can specifically use your curse technique to keep brains as sugared as possible. That's super not how she says it. In fact, that's pretty much the least medically sound thing I've ever said out loud. Specifically, she says, Amai, you'll be assisting me and Nita on the medical team. You'll help compensate for the brain expending all of its sugar while the curse technique is in use, to which he says, got it. But Shoko continues by saying, but don't overdo it. Collapsing from elevated glucose levels would defeat the purpose. Now, this seems to imply that Amai has the ability, by increasing glucose levels in the brain, to essentially give jujutsu sorcerers who have exhausted all of their cursed energy back, which is going to be massively important for Yuta, who was already on his deathbed and barely had any cursed energy left when he switched into Gojo. And thus it's technically a possibility that Amaya has already been useful, and the reason that Gojo/Yuta is running around at full power against Sukuna right now is because Amai gave him his cursed energy back through the medium of a glucose transfusion directly into his brain. But it's also a possibility that Amai will become useful when Yuta's trying to switch back into his own body, as it's a possibility when Yuta/Gojo lay down after their third collective battle against Sukuna that they'll be too tapped to have enough cursed energy to go full blast on the reverse curse technique like they need to fix Yuta's original body. Now, it's also technically a possibility that Gojo's brain is currently getting a glucose infusion from Amai, which would allow for the moment when Yuta switches out of his brain to possibly have a newly revived Gojo's brain put back into his body. But that's a massive stretch. But the addition of Amai into the story and the reveal that his curse technique allows for him to reinvigorate cursed energy in people's brains was not done for nothing. As in chapter 261, while he was introduced, he did a grand total of 0 things. But that's the best case scenario with the intermittent possibilities. See, because another important thing that Mei told us in chapter 261, well, not told us, but theorized about, is that there's a possibility that Yuta, after switching into Gojo's body, will lose all of the curse techniques that he copied, which doesn't necessarily make sense to me, or anybody who knows how Kenjaku's curse technique works. But still, essentially what Mei is saying here is that there's a possibility that after Yuta switches into Gojo's brain, he'll just have Gojo's curse techniques, like the Limitless, the Six Eyes, Hollow Purple, Red, Blue, and Unlimited Void, which he very clearly has. Now, if this is actually what ends up happening, then Yuta has no way of switching back into his body, which means that if Kenjaku's curse technique is of the intermittent type, then Yuta's lifespan in Gojo's body is essentially just a ticking clock, slowly waning away. And thus, if Kenjaku needed to re-up his control of a body every 10 minutes, week, year, month, decade, Yuta not only wouldn't be privy to that information, but also probably wouldn't be able to re-up his control. And thus Yuta, now without a copied version of Kenjaku's body swapping technique, whenever the need to re-up his control of Gojo's body came around, he would simply lose control of Gojo's body and we would be back to stage 1. That is either complete death or Gojo's body possibly taking over Yuta's brain. But the idea that Yuta would lose all his curse techniques just doesn't make all that much sense to me. See, because one of the core ideas of Kenjaku's body swapping technique is that Kenjaku would bring the curse techniques of his previous bodies along with him, which is why Kenjaku was still able to use the curse technique of Yuji's mother, the gravity curse technique, that he applied a reversal to that allowed him to make it into an anti-gravity curse technique. Or maybe it's vice versa, it's been a while. And this was truly probably the strongest aspect of Kenjaku's body swapping technique in the first place. See, because while Kenjaku openly admits that he doesn't save all the memories, battle information, and curse techniques of every body he'd ever switched into, because all of that would be too much on one brain, Kenjaku is actively able to choose curse techniques, memories, and battle information from previous bodies to hold on to. And thus, if Yuta is truly copying Kenjaku's curse technique, then he should hold on to all of his body's previous curse techniques, one of which would be copy, and another of which would be the body swapping technique. However, that's not to say that there isn't some problems with this layout. See, like we've already established, Yuta can only copy a technique for 5 minutes, which means technically if Yuta wanted to swap back into his own body, that would have to fall within the 5-minute window he has. Unless, of course, somewhere down the line he was able to reactivate his copy technique and therefore his Kenjaku's body swapping technique. And thus, like I said, the possibilities possibilities in the intermittent ending are almost limitless. Yuta could either exist in Gojo's body for as long as Kenjaku would take between reing up control of a body, and then eventually die or have Gojo take over his body whenever he hits that timer. He could finish up the fight with Sukuna in under 5 minutes, switch back into his own body while the body swapping technique is still active using his copy, or he could, prior to hitting the timer that Kenjaku's curse technique has, reactivate the copy technique that he's brought in from his old body and allow himself to switch back into his old body. And all of that is assuming that he's bringing the curse techniques from Yuta's body to Gojo's. So like I said, a lot of possibilities. And there's a lot of overlap between the intermittent possibilities and the one-time use possibilities. See, the one-time use possibilities are contingent on the fact that Kenjaku's body swapping curse technique is only something Kenjaku needs to do once. That is to say that Kenjaku opens up his skull, scoops out his brain, places it into a new body, and bing, bang, boom, that's his body for as long as he technically needs it. Meaning he doesn't need to maintain constant control of this body like Limitless, or reinvigorate his curse technique into this body every 10 minutes, day, week, year, month, all that. The second that Kenjaku switches into a body, boom, it's done. That's his body. Now, this possibility seems the second most likely, but not all that likely to me. Just based off what we saw from Geto's body and it battling back against Kenjaku, it seemed to imply to me that it was a somewhat continuous fight between body and brain, and the ferocity of that battle is heavily contingent on how powerful the body is. But if this is the reality of how Kenjaku's curse technique works, then Yuta would be able to stay in Gojo's body indefinitely. And this is really the only set of possibilities that doesn't set up Yuta and or Gojo to die together. See, because if Yuta is able to switch into Gojo's body and stay in Gojo's body, possibly forever, then we don't have to worry about Yuta bringing his old curse techniques with him. We don't have to worry about whether or not Yuta in Gojo's body would have to reactivate copy and reactivate Kenjaku's body swapping technique so that he could switch back into his old body, do maximum output RCT, and come back to life with the hopes that one day Gojo gets his original brain back. These possible endings could just possibly see Yuta running around as Gojo. Now, is that something that Yuta would want to do? Probably not, but it is living, and it would allow for Yuta to achieve Gojo's dreams for Japan, as Gojo could fix the Jujutsu world, protect Japan from the international coalition of body snatchers like the US, China, and Russia that want to use Japanese citizens to milk out cursed energy and make weapons, and so on and so forth. Yuta would make sure that Gojo's body was still put to good use. And while that's super dark, it does technically make Gojo's face and Yuta's brain survive until the end of the story. And if we're being real, the majority of you who want Gojo back just want to see his face. Now, obviously, if Yuta is able to maintain Gojo's body for as long as he needs, there's also still the backdoor possibility of Yuta reinitiating his body swapping technique and switching back into his old body, and possibly Gojo coming back from an amide glucose blood transfusion, as Yuta would be able to fix his own body and Gojo's body is already fixed. But knowing Gege's writing style, as I believe I do, I mean, I was the only person that theorized that Yuta was going to swap into somebody else's body to use Gojo's techniques. Now, did I say it was going to be using Kenjaku's curse technique? No, but still closer than everybody else. I believe if Yuta is able to maintain Gojo's body indefinitely, he's probably going to stay in there. It's just meaner that way. But not all of the possible endings to Yuta and Gojo's story have to be mean. See, because now that we've established all of the possibilities that Meme has laid out for us, let's talk about a theory. A theory, while not as happy as Gojo and Yuta both surviving in their own bodies, is admittedly substantially less copium than that, and also a whole lot more logical. And that theory is that Yuta, in the 5 minutes he has left controlling Kenjaku's curse technique, does a brain swap with Megumi and Sukuna's body to create a body with 3 souls in it, also known as an autonomous cursed corpse. Now, this theory was emailed to me by a very intelligent follower of mine named Gabriel, who brought up this idea and its possible connection to Panda and Principal Masamichi. See, Panda is what's known as an autonomous cursed corpse. In the way that Panda operates is that Panda has 3 souls inside of it that keep each other in check. And these 3 souls create a mashup of all of their personalities to make one new, fully autonomous and operating, essentially human being, though Panda is a panda. Now, Gabriel points out that this lore drop from Principal Masamichi about how to create an autonomous cursed corpse, it really never amounts to anything. Nobody else ever tries to make an autonomous cursed corpse. Panda's not that important to the story, but how Panda is made is very interesting, complex, and nobody else has ever done it. And thus Gabriel goes on to elaborate that there's a possibility that Masamichi making this autonomous cursed corpse using, very notably, 3 souls could have been a long shot foreshadowing to the possibility of Yuta popping over into Sukuna and Megami's bodies. And here's where we get into a little bit of Psych 101. See, the theorized and kind of explained reason for why 3 souls make an autonomous cursed corpse work in the first place is based off one of the most fundamental psychological theories in existence. And that theory is the theory of id, ego, and superego, also known as the 3 main parts of our psychology, told to us all by Sigmund Freud. And if you want to believe in Freudian psychology, go ahead, just leave your mother alone for a little bit. Now, the way that the id, the ego, and the superego breaks down is rather interesting. Freud basically says that the id is your primal instincts, part of your brain that tells you to drink water, eat food, copulate, make babies, part of your brain that tells you take and take and take until you're satiated, while ego is your personality, who you are as a person. See, ego works actively with id. Ego wants things the same as id wants things. However, when id would tell you to snatch baby out of a candy's hand so that you can have candy, the ego would tell you that's not a realistic way to go about things, and that instead we could acquire candy from a store. See, the ego is the planning side of your brain that makes realistic goals for you to acquire what you want and need, while the superego is your morals. Let's say that id is telling you that you're hungry and you need to eat right now, and thus your ego would tell you, well, we just passed by a Subway, we could go get a sandwich. Your superego would tell you, no, a loved one is cooking dinner for you tonight, and if you show up completely stuffed and tell them you ate Subway before coming to their lovely dinner, they're going to be upset with you, and that would be impolite. So id is primal wants and needs. Ego is planning, and superego is morals. And thus, if Yuta were to switch his brain over into Sukuna's body, Yuta would enter into a 3-soul equation with Sukuna, Megami, and himself, where Sukuna would become the id, Megami would become the ego, and Yuta would become the superego. And thus, with the combined efforts of both Megami and Yuta, they would cancel out the complete evil that is Sukuna's id. The Megami, with the support of Yuta's superego, would become the ego of this 3-soul problem. And in a way, Sukuna, Megami, and Yuta would then become an autonomous cursed corpse. Now, Gabriel goes on to say that the way that Yuji is tied into all of this is that there's a possibility that Yuji lands another Black Flash or just another regular punch against Sukuna that allows him to reach out to Megami's soul, destabilizing Sukuna and making him weak enough so that Yuta's able to pop his brain into Sukuna's skull. At which point, this new autonomous cursed corpse that Gabriel lovingly refers to as Mikada would then come under the care and supervision of Yuji. And this new personality of Mikada wouldn't be as evil or as brash as Sukuna, not as dumb and down and out as Megami, not as loving and as soft as Yuta, but instead would be an amalgamation of all of these traits coming together in one body. And then either this new Mikada or Yuji would become the next vessel for Rika, though Gabriel does admit that this is rather unlikely.
But then, Nick, what happens to Gojo's body?
Well, remember how we've been talking about Amai keeping Gojo's body alive with a glucose transfusion? I actually got that idea from Gabriel, who stated that after Yuta kicks off the whole Mikada experience, that Gojo's body could be taken back to Shoko, and his new glucose-invigorated brain could be placed back into his body, and Gojo would possibly be brought back to life. And then Gojo could go on to protect Japan in all the ways that I already laid out. But I'm curious to hear from you guys. Out of all these possibilities, which do you believe is the most likely? And which is your favorite? Tell me in the comments below, and while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Genuinely, I was gonna be like, oh, I believe this possibility is the most likely, but who knows anymore?